Hi there, my name is Siobhan Fallon. I'm an author and I'm a military spouse. It's my being a military spouse that first drew me into Little Bighorn studies and wanting to learn more about the lives of the Seventh Cavalry and especially their family members. I have a sort of special curiosity about Annie Yates. She spent a lot of her childhood in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is where the Army has sent me and my family and where we live right now. She moved back here later in life. She attended the same church that I attend, and she's buried here in Carlisle. Before I get started, I want you all to know I am not a professional historian. I'm a fiction writer. If you're annoyed by people saying like or putting their hands in the air, please just shut this video off right now. I don't mind. I just can't believe how many people commented in the comment section of my other presentations about how irritating I was. Fortunately, more people said really lovely things, and I'm giving it another shot. Thanks for watching, and here we go. Annie Gibson Roberts was born in Philadelphia on April 27, 1849. Though she spent a lot of her childhood in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, at the home of her maternal grandfather, John Bannister Gibbon. That's his house. He was a judge here. He was part of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and his house still stands. A friend of mine just sent me the address 2 days ago, and I drove downtown and took that photo. It's pretty incredible. Annie's father, Milner Roberts, was a prominent railroad engineer, and he traveled an awful lot. When Annie was 8, her mother died after a difficult pregnancy. Soon after, her father went to Brazil to build the first railroad in that country. When Annie was 10, he returned for the family and took Annie and her 5 brothers to Rio de Janeiro to live with him. Life in Brazil was crazy. Annie was very athletic. She horseback rode. She was swimming all the time. She was the fleetest person I have ever seen, one of her brothers said, which is a really handy trait to have when you are the one girl in a house full of 5 brothers. This family photo here was taken toward the end of their time in Brazil. That's Annie in the center with her dad's arm on her shoulder. In 1865, right after the Civil War, the father moved everyone back to the States. In 1869, Annie's family moved to St. Louis. Her father was chief engineer on the construction of a bridge spanning the Mississippi River. They moved into a suite of rooms at the Southern Hotel and were promptly welcomed into polite society. Annie was more than welcomed into the society of the officers who were stationed at the Department of Missouri. It wasn't long before she was turning down marriage proposals, and no wonder. She was lovely, she was brilliant, she could beat them in billiards. She would sing popular ballads and songs with them, and she called those her little squall, but I'm sure she was quite charming. She actually writes in her journal that she thought she had an, quote, ugly mug, but clearly the men disagreed. A friend of hers would later write, "Grave, sweet Annie, there was something compelling in her great dark eyes, a vivacity of youth and fun and warmth of nature that reached out to everyone." Wesley Merritt was one of the men who spent a lot of time with Annie. He didn't propose. I don't think he was a suitor, but they were very good friends. Those of you familiar with George Custer's life will remember that Merritt and Custer were both promoted to Brigadier General of the Volunteers on the same day in the Civil War, and there's always talk of this ongoing rivalry between them. Also, if you're familiar with the Reno Court of Inquiry later on, or watched my presentation on it, you'll recognize Merritt as one of the judges who sat on that court in 1879. Okay, sorry, back to Annie. There was a gentleman who did secure a place in Annie's heart. Annie describes Lieutenant Paul Dahlgren as bright as a new shilling. Paul came from a distinguished military family. He was a ladies' man, and his and Annie's romance was rather tumultuous. He gave her a ring. She lost the ring. They had a huge fight and they broke up. She was furious at him, that he was mad at her for losing the ring. On and on. She found the ring. He saw the ring. They had this big reconciliation, etc. Young romance. But that might be one of the reasons why Annie's uncle, Major George Gibson, invited Annie to come out and spend the summer with him and his wife Fanny at Fort Hays. He was the post commander. That's Fort Hays, Kansas, and that was the summer of 1870. And this is when Annie enters into the orbit of the 7th Cavalry. I want to recommend that book to all of you, A Summer on the Plains with Custer's Cavalry, edited by Brian Pohanka. A lot of the information I use in this presentation I found there. This book is readily available. It's wonderful. It's full of pranks and picnics, guitar playing and bonfires, buffalo hunts and sewing bees. There's scares of Native American attacks. There's a shootout between Wild Bill Hickok and 2 soldiers. There's even the death of a baby at the fort. The readers get a real sense of how the 7th Cavalry lived. We usually focus on one bloody day at the Little Bighorn and how they died, and it's nice to see the flip side of that and recognize the friendships and the relationships, and that it wasn't all, you know, just one dark day in Montana. There are a lot of appearances of the Custers, the Benteens, the Renos. Annie meets George Custer on her 2nd day there. She says, "Custer took me all over the camp, showed me his horses, dogs, young antelope, and rattlesnakes." She mentions Libby Custer and says she was, as usual, sweet and lovely. She talks about young Fred Benteen. She calls him the sweetest child, but this evening he behaved so contrarily in church that Miss Hewlett and I lost all control of ourselves. She also spends a lot of time with Mrs. Reno, which is wonderful because we very rarely get to see Mary Hannah. She's just kind of like this specter in Major Reno's past, but here she's living, breathing, and raising a son. Here are a few photos of the 7th Cavalry at Fort Hays, or actually outside of Fort Hays. That tent photo, that's George Custer leaning against a tent pole. That's Libby Custer off to the left, sort of leaning forward, looking a little coquettish. And that's Thomas Weir in the center in the white pants, and there might be a dog that he's petting. They didn't have permanent quarters and sort of had a tent city set out at their camp. The other photo on the right is of a buffalo hunt. There are men and women on horseback, all mixed around in that photo hunting buffalo, which is just an incredible shot. In the beginning, in Annie's journal, she's still pining away for Paul Dahlgren. She's complaining about not getting his mail, but after a while, he starts to appear less and less, and Captain George Yates and Thomas Weir appear more and more. Both Yates and Weir served with distinction with Michigan units during the Civil War, and they were longtime friends of George Custer. Bye-bye. Annie writes of a July 6th buffalo hunt that she participated in. "Hurrah, no fears today, but the wildest, most thrilling, rapturous delight. Riding today with Colonel Weir, who was equally reckless as myself, I struck the buffalo with my pistol 4 or 5 times, then leapt off the horse and hit it with Colonel Weir's carbine. At one of my shots it fell on its haunches, the next it rolled over on its side, breathing hard, and soon was dead." There are comments like, "I'm going riding with Colonel Yates tomorrow and with Weir on Monday evening." Or, "I took a very pleasant ride with Colonel Weir this evening." And then on the next page there'll be, "Colonel Yates, being officer of the day, could not ride, but did spend the evening with me." By mid-August, Yates is emerging as the winner. "Yates called this morning and spent several hours. I went riding with him this evening and we had a very strange conversation." The next day she writes, "I did not get a chance to see Yates alone. I want to explain something to him." It's no wonder that the next time Annie talks of Thomas Weir, she says that he is as lonely as he could be. On August 23rd, she says, "I got some ribbons to make Colonel Weir's sword knot. Captain Yates got my ribbons out of the doctor's pocket and was going to pin them on his cap. I'm glad he didn't, as Colonel Weir would have seen them." On September 3rd, Yates and Annie gathered flowers, but we had a very serious conversation. He understands me better than anyone I ever knew. She will describe Yates as a superb-looking officer. His eyes, very keen and observant, were of a rare, deep blue. He had white, regular teeth and a physique absolutely faultless. He was said to be one of the handsomest men in the army. On September 4th, while her Aunt Fanny is upstairs, Annie and Yates sit below in the parlor. Suddenly the aunt calls down to her and demands that she come up and tell her why she has been silent for so long. I too, Aunt Fanny, want to know what they were doing in that parlor. The secret's out. On September 6th, Aunt Fanny is still very upset with Annie. Annie writes, "The past 3 days have been a perfect nightmare." She has a nice, long talk with Weir. Well, it might have been nice for Annie, but I don't think it was very nice for Weir. The next time she talks about him or mentions him at all, he's drunk and upset. "It seems Colonel Weir did not like my offering to take the wine away from him. It hurt his pride. I was surprised, when we had always been the best of friends, that he should have misunderstood me so." The next day she and Thomas Weir go riding. Colonel Weir threw the reins on his horse's neck and galloped him fearfully, recklessly over the prairie. I trembled for his life. While George Yates is away in the field, Annie departs from Fort Hays and returns to her family in St. Louis. Like Libby's father, Annie's father also forbids her from corresponding with George Yates, presumably because Yates had been divorced. Annie breaks off the relationship. Dun dun dun. This is when, of course, Paul Dahlgren re-enters the picture. He starts seeing Annie again. Then Annie learns he has been courting her good friend as well. The man is no longer bright shilling, but keeps turning up like a bad penny. Annie ends this relationship once and for all. Meanwhile, after a long siege of letter writing and even a surprise visit, George Yates, much as George Custer was able to do, wins the approval of Annie's father. On February 12, 1872, Annie marries George Yates in Manhattan. Almost exactly 9 months after Annie and Yates are married, George Livingston Yates is born in Louisville, Kentucky, where the Seventh Cavalry were reinforcing Reconstruction in the South. Bessie Violet Yates was born at Fort Abraham Lincoln on September 25, 1874. Their son Milner was born on November 27, 1875. And in time they would realize he was suffering from a severe mental disability. Annie was so debilitated during this pregnancy and the birth that Yates had to cancel the trip they had been planning to the States to visit their families. That spring, with 3 children under the age of 4, Yates was busy preparing for the upcoming Centennial Campaign of 1876. In the weeks preceding the campaign, Annie's 2 brothers arrived at Fort Abraham Lincoln. Her older brother, George, who was going to be employed as a clerk and liaison for the Northern Pacific Railroad at Fort Lincoln, and her younger brother, Robert, who was going to take the field with Custer's regiment as a civilian teamster and correspondent for the New York Sun. Annie learned she was pregnant again when she said goodbye to her husband on May 17, 1876. Custer had promised Yates an extended leave of absence when the 7th returned. Of course, that reunion never happened. On June 25, 1876, George Yates died with Custer and more than 200 other officers and soldiers at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Yates's body was found not far from Custer's on Last Stand Hill. He had been badly mutilated, but his body was recognized by the fine set of teeth that Annie admired so much, and remnants of a blue shirt he was wearing. A watch that Annie had given him before the fight was recovered when a Native American Indian brought it into the trading store run by Yates' own brother. Small world. The wives learned of the tragedy on July 5th, 1876. I love that photo of Annie. It's very soon after the tragedy, and she just still looks unbroken. I don't know, she looks feisty. Annie and her children departed for Abraham Lincoln on July 30th, 1876. She traveled with fellow widows Libby Custer, Maggie Calhoun, and Nettie Smith. All the women, of course, were dressed in black. They traveled by steamship, multiple trains, and after 5 days, Annie, Maggie, and Libby arrived in Monroe, Michigan. Annie miscarried her 4th child just weeks later. Supposedly that's when her dark hair started to become streaked with gray. On July 1877, Annie's husband's remains were recovered from the battlefield, and on August 3rd, George Yates, Tom Custer, James Calhoun, Algernon Smith, and Donald McIntosh were given a military funeral at Fort Leavenworth. Annie was there. In 1877, Annie began teaching French and music at Boyd's Young Ladies Seminary in Monroe, Michigan. And that's the school where Libby Custer had gone and also where she graduated as the class valedictorian. Annie would teach there for about 4.5 years. Annie did some writing of her own, but she was also a huge help to Libby and Libby's memoirs, the 3 that she wrote. Annie and Libby remained very good friends. Libby acted as godmother to Annie's children and also to some of her grandchildren. In 1881, Annie returned to Carlisle. Yay! My friend sent me this address about 2 days ago, as I mentioned earlier, and we think Annie lived in an apartment in that sort of beige building there on the corner. Now it's a little chocolate factory / chocolate shop. Annie's father had left her a small trust. She had her military spouse pension, and she also continued to teach and to be a private tutor. She also had to care for her son Milner, whose health continued to deteriorate, and he required near constant attention. About this time, Annie became a Catholic, and that is her church, St. Patrick's, here in Carlisle. When her son Milner died of pneumonia in 1896, Annie moved to Maryland to live with her brother and his family, and then in around 1910 she moved to New York City to be closer to her surviving children. On the evening of December 9th, 1914, Annie was shopping. There are no witnesses who saw exactly what happened, but it's assumed that while she was waiting on the platform, she either fainted or her dress was caught by an approaching train. She was dragged onto the tracks and gravely injured. Her skull and both her legs were fractured, and she died 2 hours later at Bellevue Hospital. Annie was laid to rest on December 12, 1914, next to her son Milner at St. Patrick's Church in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So we've been talking about Annie, but she really isn't that different from many of the other officer wives who joined their husbands on the frontier. They were often highly educated, upper middle class, well-connected young women who decided to marry an officer, often against the wishes of their families. That quote right there above, "The army and the plains were no settings for any man's daughter," was supposedly from the father of Molly McIntosh and Katie Gibson, who were 2 sisters who ended up marrying 2 officers, also in the 7th Cavalry. So why would these women enter into this uncertain life on the frontier, terrible housing when there was housing, terrible food when there was food, drought and excruciating heat one minute, floods and freezing temperatures the next? They were always moving, or they were always separated from their husbands. But I think I know why. I mean, you probably all do. But when you read these memoirs, Libby Custer's memoirs, or Annie's diaries, or a plethora of other books by frontier military spouses, you can't help but notice that there was this wild and exuberant freedom that these women found at these shabby frontier posts. And they had experiences and opportunities they never would have had within the confines of their very strict Victorian society. Libby writes of her fellow military spouses. She calls them heroic women for their roles as pioneers. And I think she's right. I think her peers, the Army wives, knew it. They felt necessary, and they knew that they and their husbands were playing a very vital and meaningful role in history. I mean, look at us now. It's 100 years later, more than 100 years later, and we're talking about Annie Yates, Libby Custer, and the others. So as sad and tragic as many of these women's lives may have been, or, you know, the decades of widowhood that they lived alone, neither Annie nor Libby remarried, I think their contributions were remarkable, and they're just an incredible inspiration. Okay, almost done. Last slide, and then you're finished with me. There are some books that I would recommend. Those aren't by any means all the books, but that's some of the ones I just pulled down off my shelves that focus on military families, lives on the frontier. I also, again, recommend Brian Pohanka's edited Annie Yates diaries. If you are curious about some of Annie's suitors and wondering to yourself, like I was a while ago, what if she'd married somebody else? Would her life have been happier? Well, not necessarily the case. Paul Dahlgren, he got married, moved to Rome. He became the United States Consul General. In 1875, he started acting a little strange. He had a heart condition, but he was writing these long conspiracy letters. He was like walking around with a pistol threatening people. He was firing his staff, talking about suicide, just being kind of all around bizarre. On March 23rd, 1876, he was found dead. Coroner called it a heart attack, but it was later learned that he had been taking just massive quantities of his prescriptions, up to 24 times his normal amount. So very unhappy ending there. Thomas Weir, who is my favorite officer of the 7th Cavalry, he did not fare much better. He was with the 7th Cavalry at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He was not with Custer, though. He was with Benteen's attack force. He was with Benteen when Benteen got the final order from Custer saying, "Come on, big village, bring packs." Benteen moved on to Reno Hill, where he found Reno and his kind of scattered and wounded troops there. Benteen remained. He and Reno were consolidating everybody, tending the wounded. Thomas Weir rode off, continued on to the sound of Custer's guns in the distance. Weir and his company stopped at a place that is now known as Weir Point and may have watched the end of Custer and his men. We're not quite sure how much of the fight he could have seen or what he could have seen with the smoke in the distance. Unfortunately, nobody will ever know because Thomas did not leave a record of it. He was dead within 6 months of the fight. He was found in a hotel room. They called it brain congestion, but it's commonly understood that he was suffering from severe PTSD, depression, acute alcoholism. So we'll never know what he saw and what he knew. Last thing, I would like to thank a few people. Thank you, Annie Donofrio. She was the friend who kept telling me all those addresses, and I'd drive down to Carlisle and take the pictures that I showed you guys. That's a photo of Annie with her very good friend, the late Brian Pohanka, who wrote the book about Annie Yates. Annie is like the Yates expert these days, and even the Roberts family, and she's a fantastic researcher and writer. Also like to thank Dale Kozman. Don't give him any of the blame, but you can give him all the credit because he's just a wonderful resource for Little Bighorn information, everything. There's just a lot of incredible and very generous people in this field, Indian Wars and Little Bighorn studies. Thank you to all of them. Thank you to you guys, whoever has lasted this long. Really appreciate it. And I hope you all, I don't know, go out and read some more books and leave a comment, only if it's nice. Thanks again. All right. Stay tuned. I'm going to maybe do more. We'll see.